Top stories in the news of government corruption, economic inequality, racism and its consequences, fracking and the harm to our environment, surveillance and personal privacy. So many examples of injustice and dysfunction that I can scarcely decide which to address first or how. When the old approaches of protesting and boycotting no longer seem to have much effect, what alternatives do we have that will win the day for the good guys? The questions that Sharon Welch poses in our reading this morning remind me that changing our lives for the better is going to require a new set of responses that can serve us for the long haul. Welch also reminds me of how much this political struggle depends on values that I would identify as spiritual qualities: hope, vision, relationship, courage, and perseverance. And reminds me that our congregations will have to be an important part of this work. When I preached here 3 years ago about the subject of compassion, I shared the observations of Karen Armstrong about how destructive it has been for religion to be fixated on having the right answer rather than on living a more compassionate life. My preparation for this sermon has given me the opportunity to reflect more on the same question: why we so persistently hang our hopes on being right, even when there is often little real payoff in it. If powerful political and corporate leaders are unmoved by our eloquence and persistence, and our careful arguments no longer seem to be creating enough real change, then what will help us shape lives that are meaningful and societies that are just? Welch echoes these questions, asking, how then do we work with power and passion for social justice without the assurances of eventual victory, and without the dynamics of self-righteousness and demonizing? What can replace the vitality of being right and on the winning side? This may be the basic question for us as political creatures, beings who live in community, share material and social resources, and at least in theory work together toward a healthy shared future. It may also be the basic equation for us as spiritual creatures, beings who expect our lives to have meaning, who create communities where our search for that meaning can take place with kindred spirits. We have cultivated a strong sense of integrity, such that we know when our political system is perpetrating injustice, and we sense when a community is no longer our home. But after we have voiced our objections and taken our leave, what do we create in its place? From the perspective of others around the globe, we as a society are so blessed, so thoroughly surrounded with safety and health and beauty and pleasure. And yet so many of us feel helpless about changing our lives. It is easier to criticize what is wrong with our world than to create something better. And many Americans have become cynical that any change simply replaces one problem with another equally bad one. I call this the postmodern dilemma, that we have identified the old order and the traditional dogmas as unworkable, but we're having trouble finding alternatives that aren't just as bad. And Welch, who has at her fingertips history's most brilliant philosophers and social reformers, offers us a way forward not in traditional social theory, but in the model of jazz. Why jazz? She turns to literary scholar Jed Rasula for an answer, who says, I learned from jazz how to hear the world differently. I have learned from jazz how to work with limits and opportunities, possibility and ambiguity, obstacles, and challenges. I see in jazz a model of meaning, a model of responsiveness, without progress or repetition, without self-abnegation or self-righteousness. Welch has unpacked this metaphor more fully in her book, where she writes, "Jazz emerges from the interplay of structure and improvisation, collectivity and individuality, tradition and innovation. This ability to improvise is fueled both by individual effort and creativity, and by group synergy. It is not completely free-form. A key element in jazz improvisation is respect for tradition and an ability to learn from tradition rather than merely repeating it." Welch looks to the long history of jazz to suggest new ways of responding to the tensions of our complicated lives. Africans brought their musical traditions with them when their lives were uprooted by the slave trade, and they adapted their songs to European forms and the use of harmony, while maintaining the distinctive blue notes of their music from back home. The result was a tremendous lineage of new American musical genres: spirituals, ragtime, blues, swing, and jazz. And that's just acknowledging what was in place by the 1930s. Welch singles out jazz in particular as, quote, "the mix of creativity and persistence, of living outside of and in defiance of the stifling mantle of racism." She continues, "I find it ironic and yet fitting that we who are white can also find in jazz resources for creating identities as Americans outside of racism." Even as Welch sees in jazz the response of the human spirit over the great national sin of slavery, she also cautions us about getting too caught up in analyzing it or classifying it. Instead, she encourages us to simply admire and enjoy how jazz artists offer an alternative to rigid dualisms in which either-or thinking leaves us feeling stuck and powerless at the apparent lack of solutions. Social philosopher Cornel West adds that jazz is not just music, but a way of being in the world. He calls, quote, "an improvisational mode of protean, fluid, and flexible disposition toward reality, suspicious of either-or viewpoints." The more I hear scholars reflecting on the deeper meanings of jazz, the more I like it as a metaphor. And so I spent some time reflecting on how jazz might inform our lives as seekers. The example of jazz shows us, first of all, how important it is to have a certain level of humility. Although a beginner might assume that jazz at its most radical is simply freeform, Welch reiterates that a necessary first step in cultivating this improvisational mode in our lives is actually a respect for tradition and a commitment to listening. James Collier writes in his book, Jazz, the American Theme Song, "One of the worst accusations that can be flung at a musician is that he or she doesn't listen. The unwillingness to take into account what everybody else is doing is taken as arrogance, a mark of disrespect for one's fellow players, and is seen as damaging the music." End quote. This starting point strikes me as especially challenging for many of us who are accustomed to expressing our opinions and who expect to be heard, maybe are a little less eager to listen to others' views, for fear perhaps that we'll feel pressured by their dogma. Jazz reminds us, first of all, to open our ears and respectfully listen. The second lesson is to be truly ourselves, to bring an authentic presence to our encounters with this complicated and conflicted world. Others might demand that we smooth over tensions by compromising our genuine selves. But authenticity is a condition that many of the jazz greats explicitly mention. When Dizzy Gillespie was asked the question, "What is jazz?" he answered, "Well, jazz is the search for truth. And truth is what is, not what was or what will be. Truth is in the moment. To play who or what you are at that moment, that's a skill that has to be developed in all musicians. And there's a kind of serenity that comes from simply being who you are." I was struck at this reminder that being authentic is a skill that requires effort and practice. The great Miles Davis confirmed this, advising, "You have to play a long time to be able to play like yourself." Perhaps it should not be surprising that I hear from so many people about the difficult journey it has been for them to finally live as their genuine selves. One of the life lessons of jazz is that the most brilliant creative moments are the fruits of our quest to be authentic. However, our determination to be true to ourselves can't be expressed as selfishness or the pig-headed sentiment of my way or the highway. An especially paradoxical lesson of jazz is that we have to be able to collaborate, even stretch ourselves to work with others whose styles and inclinations are different from our own. And this raises for me the issue of trust. It's easier for our activism to be limited to check writing and email petitions and not working directly with others whose vision differs from our own. The creative interplay that makes jazz innovative and subversive comes partly from the very differences and tensions that naturally exist within us and between us. And this means that we have to develop our ability to trust not only others, but also ourselves. Those of us who are squeamish about conflict may have trouble enjoying these creative moments that can arise up out of it. Jazz is born out of the confrontation between different elements that fit together in many ways, some with ease and some with great difficulty. And when it works, we experience a vitality that draws us out of our safe, habitual cocoons into genuine creative engagement. Even as I'm saying this, though, I wonder whether some of you aren't thinking that I'm making this picture look suspiciously rosy. The jazz greats are quick to reassure us that their collaborations have not always been successful. Trombonist Benny Green observed that jazz operates at the knife edge of failure, that a fragile mood of trust can be drowned out or jumbled in an arrangement that just does not work. One of the most important lessons from jazz for me personally is that we have to make our peace with these collaborations and creative tensions inevitably containing mistakes, and that we must be willing to stretch ourselves without the guarantee of either perfection or success. I'm going to be getting on a plane in just a few hours to fly to Transylvania, where I'll be teaching leadership skills to Unitarians and Unitarian Universalists from all over Europe. And I'm trying to keep this message in mind. Collaboration is hard work, and we will almost certainly step on one another's toes in the process. My other great musical love is the old-time music often associated with Appalachia. Perhaps less an expression of creative tension than jazz, but is still a genre that embraces that roughness and risk of live performance. I had become so accustomed to a certain level of perfection in my careers as a scientist and a minister that my constant fumbles on the fiddle and banjo are almost unbearably embarrassing to me. And more often than not, I simply have to put the instrument down until my frustration passes. the possibility that mistakes might not spoil the whole moment is an exhilarating idea, but is still, for me at the least, a mighty challenge. Remember that jazz arose out of the brutal and dehumanizing exploitation of the slave industry, which might have killed those musical traditions at their roots. The survival of African rhythms and voices in the legacy of jazz is testimony that no mistake is ever the end of the story. Welch also draws from her work with feminist theologies to challenge the Unitarian Universalist habit of focusing perhaps a bit too much on ever-increasing perfection. And she reminds us that it is actually in our humaneness, our flawed humanity, that our strength actually lies. And she reminds us that it is that we possess in our flawed beings a compassionate, creative voice that can speak to real suffering in a way that our striving for perfection does not. Jazz exemplifies the recognition that our inevitable mistakes are an intrinsic part of our stories, rather than something we must erase from our stories. Lastly, it's worth noting that the success of jazz has not eliminated other genres of music. Our polarized world is often not interested in embracing innovative responses, but that must not stop us from making them. Unitarian Universalists have long assumed that if we only gave people enough information, they will naturally see things our way. Especially in our entrenched political struggles, we have to recognize that people often cling to the same approaches and labels, no matter how unsuccessful they are, rather than consider an idea they do not yet trust. Jazz was rejected by aficionados of respectable music as too dissonant, moody, or irreverent, the product of seedy clubs and people with darker skin. If we are to choose radical curiosity and openness over moral certainty, we will attract criticism that we are weak and faithless in our flexibility and experimentation, so we have to be persistent in reminding the world that we don't need to settle for those either-or answers. Jazz reminds us, above all, that not all of the possibilities have yet been explored. And it's perhaps this last point that I think makes jazz such an appealing metaphor for Unitarian Universalists in particular. The optimism that new responses are still possible. We have left behind the times when rigid old models of being religious worked well, if in fact they ever did work well. But the pressure to fall back into that either-or response is still so strong. Many hold on to familiar choices that do not work, and others will want to replace traditional dogma with equally rigid alternatives. I love being a Unitarian Universalist because we each have the opportunity to experience a journey of meaning and purpose that cultivates our own values and passion, but does not abandon us to make that journey alone. There are so many ways to get from point A to point B, and many of us have already abandoned those well-paved and well-traveled roads as too limiting and uninteresting. But this does not mean that we're left groping in the dark with no guidance at all, or clearing a path that no one has ever walked and no one will ever walk again. We recognize that there are times when we need security and times when we need spontaneity. And the life well lived is a dance between those two, remembering the journeys of those who have walked before us, but also relishing the moments when we are able to stretch ourselves into new territories. That is what makes Unitarian Universalism so much like the art form of jazz. It's not just about what your beliefs and values are, it is the fact that more seeking is always possible. Because it's so easy to let this conversation be too abstract, I'd like to invite your thoughts and questions into the mix. How do you make sense of complexity and tension in trying to live a good life? What barriers do you experience to reaching a creative resolution? What gives you strength and clarity and helps get you unstuck? What role can communities like this one play in helping us to improvise our way out of a difficult place? The music of this congregation is incomplete without you. And your words and deeds are the missing piece that makes this composition complete.